Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Michael Tukiva. I'm the president CEO of Pocono Mountains United Way, nestled in the Pocono Mountains in Monroe County, one of the rural counties of Pennsylvania. And if you are attending today's session, then you are some of the good people that care for our community. And on behalf of the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, let me share that it is a pleasure to spend the next hour with you. I would encourage you to take notes and to use the Q&A function. I love to see interaction and those aha moments in real time. And as you know, because you signed up and you are in this room, our topic is housing in rural Pennsylvania, specifically rural affordable housing. Today's session will include a discussion on the changing demographics within this community, as well as the unique needs and challenges that exist. I like to start with the end in sight. So why is affordable rural housing important? First, it's healthy. Studies show that quality, affordable housing has multiple positive effects on people's health and well-being. It's also good for kids. There is no question that stable, affordable housing is critical for children's health and well-being. And the last three, it builds sustainability, it creates jobs, and it promotes diversity. Now, there are many other reasons why affordable housing is important. So even as we begin, I want you to start brainstorming what you see those to be. Now, it is my privilege to introduce today's speaker. I recently met Dr. Kopko, and his breadth of knowledge on today's topic will provide each of us with many takeaways for our individual and collective work. And before I turn the proverbial mic over to him, please allow me to share a little bit more about his background. Dr. Kyle Kopko earned his PhD in political science from The Ohio State University in 2010. From then until 2020, Dr. Kopko served as the political science professor at Elizabethtown College. During this time, Dr. Kopko served in a variety of academic and administrative roles, including assistant dean and associate dean. Then in 2020, Dr. Kopko was appointed director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, which is a legislative agency of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. In this capacity, Dr. Kopko oversees the center's operations, including research and grant programs that examine a wide range of policy issues that affect rural Pennsylvanians. He has spoken on a wide range of policy and political topics and has taught courses on American national government, Pennsylvania politics, and constitutional law. Dr. Kopko is the author or co-author of more than 30 scholarly publications, including 2 university press books on vice presidential candidates. And Dr. Kopko's research has also received national and international media attention in numerous outlets, including some little publications that you might have heard of, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times, the British Broadcasting Corporation, CNN, and C-SPAN. Dr. Kopko is a native of central Pennsylvania, so he's going to have some personal information and knowledge on this topic, and he enjoys living in Elizabethtown with his wife, Sarah, and his daughters, Marie and Clara. So get ready, folks, buckle up. We have a great session in front of us, and Dr. Kopko, the stage is yours, and feel free to share your screen when ready.
All right. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Michael. And I'm very glad to be here today with everyone. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Here we go. And Michael, is that coming across on your end, or is this the presenter view here?
I see it, but I also see your next slide as well if you want that view.
Let me just change one other thing. Sorry about that, folks.
Looks good.
Okay. And as Michael mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. We are a legislative agency within the Pennsylvania General Assembly. And the shorthand description is it's essentially a think tank that the General Assembly created in the 1980s. And the reason why it was created was to better understand trends and needs and policy differences in our rural communities. As many of us on this call know that rural Pennsylvania is very diverse. The logistical infrastructure, the needs are different than many other communities throughout Pennsylvania. So we were established in 1987, and our enabling legislation was again revised in 2009, and we provide two overarching um, programs, not only for the General Assembly, but also for local officials and the general public. First and foremost, we administer grants to conduct research on a wide range of rural conditions. And we do this through partnerships with our state universities, so Penn State system, PASHE system, and the regional campuses of the University of Pittsburgh. And then we also maintain a comprehensive database on various statistical indicators of our rural communities. Many of these indicators are federal in nature. They come from the federal government, or they come from the state government, or original resources that we publish within the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, and even private resources as well. We try to make use of as many data points as possible to better understand our rural communities. Now, I say this all up front to provide some background, but also to say that the center is a resource for a wide variety of stakeholders. And if anyone would like to reach out to us at any time, if you need data, if you need information, feel free to Google us. Our website URL is also posted on the slides here. I would also be happy to provide any of these slides after this presentation. Feel free to email me. Again, you can find us on the web. So before we dig into some data here and I get to my main presentation, I just wanted to provide this snapshot on how we define rural Pennsylvania. And admittedly, there are many, many definitions as to what is rural. Whenever you take into account all the various federal agencies and offices that also provide a definition of rural, we're talking about a dozen or so definitions of what is rural. And within our office, we use population density, the average statewide population density, as a cut point, not only for counties, but also for school districts and municipalities. So what I'm presenting here is a map of the counties that are classified as urban or rural as a binary classification, and also the average population density based upon the last census in 2010. So the green counties are those that are classified as rural counties in Pennsylvania, so there are 48 of them, and then the white counties are urban counties. And we will, of course, update this definition and the number of urban and rural counties after the 2020 census data is made available to us. And again, this is all available on our website too. So feel free to peruse our website whenever you have the opportunity to do so. So one of the first things I wanted to discuss today, there are 4 general points I want to make, but the first one is that there are shifting homeownership rates within rural Pennsylvania. And I'm going to throw a lot of data at you here. So I'm going to try to hit the biggest, most important overarching points. And again, these slides are going to be available after the presentation, and I'm also happy to answer any questions about them. And if I don't know the answer to something, I will certainly get back to you as soon as possible. And this should come as no major surprise to a lot of viewers here for this presentation, but there has been a decline in the rural population within Pennsylvania. Just between 2010 and 2019, we saw almost a 3% decline in the overall rural population. And we saw a slight decline in the number of rural occupied housing units during this time. Now, interestingly, we've also seen a slight increase in the number of rural housing units as well. So up here at the very top, you can see the population overall within rural Pennsylvania and the shifts in housing units over time. Now, the reason why I share these housing units is to provide greater context for not only the types of housing units, and we'll get to ownership and rental units here in just a second, but also there are significant changes in demographics that we're witnessing, especially compared to previous census cut points. So just to put this in greater context, over the past 10 or so years, we've actually seen an increase in the number of rental units within rural Pennsylvania. So almost a 5% increase. But also we've seen a decline in rural residents who lived in their own homes that they own outright without renting them. So this is something that's been ongoing based upon the American Community Survey available through the U.S. Census Bureau. And I think it does represent a shift for the housing community. And presumably this trend will increase at least for the foreseeable future. So one takeaway point is greater numbers of folks moving towards rental units and fewer people in owner-occupied units. And I think that this helps to explain this in a little more detail. So we have a map here again of the entire state. And I think the red counties and also the striped counties are the ones that I'd like to draw your attention to. So we have in the red counties increases in renters and decreases in home ownership. So this would be in counties like Susquehanna, Bradford, Tioga, McKean, Warren, but also in other places like Blair, Huntington, Bradford, Washington, Beaver, so on and so forth. But the striped counties like Lycoming and Potter and Clearfield, we have an overall decline too. Decline in renters and home ownership. So we are seeing these rates reflected due to population changes that have been ongoing for many years now. So that's the first overall set of data points I wanted to discuss. Next, and this probably again comes as no surprise to many viewers, that rural housing is often less expensive, but we need to keep this in greater context. It's not always affordable due to household incomes within rural areas. So here what we present since 1990, 2000, 2010, and the last set of data that we have available from the ACS in 2019, the average home values in rural and urban Pennsylvania. This is the top part right here. And then on the bottom, the average gross rent in rural and urban Pennsylvania. So we see this upward trend for the most part in both home values and rental values. And as you might expect, there is a difference between urban and rural, urban being more expensive here. The average home price, also accounting for inflation, is almost $250,000 in rural communities based upon those counties that I identified earlier, about $172,000. And whenever it comes to rents, just over $1,000 in urban areas and about $800 or so in rural areas. So on the surface, it looks like things are a bit cheaper in rural areas, which is true, but what about household income? And I think that these graphics here help to answer that and place this in greater context as well. This shows what percentage of an individual's income goes towards housing costs. And again, we've broken this down between urban and rural residents, again, to provide that comparison and contrast. So this larger slice here for rural, this is actually for urban incomes, and this is for rural residents here, less than 30% of their income. But here in the yellow and red slices, those are the ones I really want to draw your attention to, where a larger percentage of one's income is devoted towards housing. So in our urban areas here, in our homeowners, I misspoke, our rural homeowners, about 50% or more of income, 7% of respondents there. For renters, 21% of renters use 50% or more of their income. And this table here helps to identify just who are we talking about here. This isn't an insignificant number of homeowners and renters in rural Pennsylvania. We're talking, more than 150,000 households across across Pennsylvania, where 50% or more of their income is being used for housing. They tend to be a little older. Among homeowners, 55% are female, 69% female among renters. Predominantly single person households. A non-trivial number are those individuals with a disability. They tend not to be individuals that have a bachelor's degree or higher. Over 20% have children under 18. For rural homeowners, 8% do not have a vehicle, but for rural renters, 36% do not have a vehicle. And when we consider the poverty rate, majority in each category are at the poverty line. So 51% rural homeowners, 64% renters. Many are without internet access, and the center maintains a significant number of reports and data points about internet access, and that's something that I can talk about a little later on. I won't make it a focal point of this presentation, but again, that is significant not only for remote working, for example, particularly during the COVID era, but also online access to education, e-commerce, so on and so forth. And you can see the median household income and housing costs vary between these two. The third overall point I would like to make is that there's been a slow recovery of the housing construction industry, particularly within rural areas. This graphic, I think, really lays out the differences between Pennsylvania and other parts of the United States. So the red dotted line shows the trend in housing starts across all the United States. So we begin with 1990 going forward to 2019, and we see, a pretty sizable gap here relative to the green line, which is rural Pennsylvania, and the purple line, which is urban Pennsylvania. So rural Pennsylvania is still on the decline here with regard to housing starts. We see a slight uptick with urban Pennsylvania, but this red line is at variance with those two data trends. And a lot of this is being driven by population increases within the southern United States, Southwest, places like that. The Northeast demographics are just on the decline. It's not just Pennsylvania. The New England states are also being hit pretty hard, and they would probably have more dramatic declines if I were to map them out here, also on this graphic. And fourth, as I mentioned before, population is changing. This map shows population change between 2010 and 2019, at the municipal level within Pennsylvania. So you can see how this works at the sub-county level. So anything shaded in blue represents a municipality that has either experienced population decline or their population is flat. Those in white represent municipalities where there has been a population increase. Now, it's not to say that this is, a stark difference between urban and rural. There are certainly some pockets within rural Pennsylvania where we have seen increases in population. So Center County is a very good example of that. There are a number of municipalities around the State College area that have grown in recent years. In the northern tier, there are a few pockets of municipalities that have also grown, but for the most part, we have seen either no change or slight decrease overall in population. So there just might not be as much demand or different types of demand as we'll see based upon some demographics here in the next few slides. So how is the population changing? It's not just a uniform change across the board. And I think here we can see how and which subgroups of the population are being affected most by these changes. So we can see based upon this graphic here, dating back to 1950 and with projections going up to 2040, changes in the 65 years of age and older population and changes in those individuals who are less than 20 years of age. So we are now at the point where those 65 years of age and older have eclipsed the younger demographic group. And you can even see down below with these maps, the shaded counties have more residents 65 years of age or older than what they do individuals who are under the age of 20. So here in 2011, you see we have 3 counties that fit that profile. 2019, it's growing. And then in 2030 and 2040, the majority of the state, not just rural Pennsylvania, but the majority of counties in the state certainly meet that profile. So we see this graying of population as well, which obviously has implications for the types of housing units, accessibility, all kinds of different implications for what is needed for housing for these demographic groups. And to further emphasize this, we can plot out the differences in the death rate and the birth rate over time. And this isn't exactly surprising relative to many other states within the Northeast. This is a trend that we're seeing in many parts of the United States as well, in addition to Pennsylvania, where the birth rate is simply on the decline and the death rate, is by comparison higher because families are simply having fewer children in recent decades compared to what they were back in the 1970s, for example. So what that means is, as we project out in the next 10, 20, 30 years, there's just simply going to be fewer people within rural Pennsylvania, which obviously has implications for housing stock and what's available and whether or not we can fill vacant properties. And related to this, particularly related to the increase in those age 65 years of age or older, there's also been an increase in single person households. And again, I think that this does tend to be among our senior citizens. Based upon our 2019 data, you can see the differences between rural residents and urban residents within Pennsylvania. So who are these individuals who are living alone? They tend to be somewhere around 60 years of age on average. They tend to be women. They also tend to be homeowners. And a non-trivial number do not have access to a vehicle. Their household income tends to be lower than the average household income. Similar rates are in the poverty line area, 19% among our rural residents, 18% among our urban residents. Many of them also do not have access to internet. 33% of our single person households in rural areas do not have internet, compared with 25% in urban Pennsylvania. At least 32% of these single person households have a disability in rural Pennsylvania, 26% in urban Pennsylvania. Many of these individuals, about almost a third in rural and urban areas, have lived in the same home for 20 or more years. So if we think about this in terms of individuals who have a disability and living in a home for a number of years, this might also mean that the houses may need to be retrofitted or adapted in some way to meet the needs of these occupants. And then how many are paying 30% or more of their income towards either housing or rental costs. So whenever you look at housing costs, so if they are homeowners, about 35% of these single person households are paying more than 30% of their income, whereas 39% of the urban population, these single person households, are paying 30% or more of their income for housing. Among renters, though, it's much higher in both rural and urban Pennsylvania. So 55% of single persons in rural Pennsylvania who are also renters are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, and 59% in urban Pennsylvania. And I also think it's worth noting that Pennsylvania overall and rural Pennsylvania has also become much more diverse within the past few decades. So the map of Pennsylvania in the upper left side of the screen represents the number of identified non-white residents. In 1990, there's about 1.3 million of those individuals across the state, and every one of these red dots here equals 10 people. Fast forward to 2019, we've added about 1.1 million more residents who are classified as non-white. And again, this isn't just happening in urban areas. This is happening across many, many counties and many, many communities within Pennsylvania. And there's no reason to believe that this is not going to continue in the future. This is an overall trend for much of the United States. But it goes to show, once again, the changing nature and demographics of our communities in the Commonwealth. So let's just have a quick overview. I know I threw a lot of data here at everyone. So it's important to keep in mind that demographics and demographic changes will affect the future of rural housing and its demand. Now, even though housing in rural Pennsylvania is relatively less expensive than urban Pennsylvania, we shouldn't necessarily say that it's affordable. Again, in rural Pennsylvania, there is a greater portion of residents who are contributing more of their income towards housing costs relative to urban residents. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. Now, even though rural Pennsylvania has been less affected by the housing crash, it's still recovering. We haven't had that uptick in housing construction like many other parts of the United States, and even relative to some urban communities within the Commonwealth. Also, again, emphasizing that the percentage of individuals who are renters within rural Pennsylvania, that's increasing, and the number of owners is decreasing over time, and that's probably going to continue over the next few years. And I think that we've also seen, based on some of the maps here presented in this presentation, that this is not a uniform change across all communities. There are different pockets where population might be changing at a faster rate. In some rural communities, population is increasing, whereas in others, it's not. Again, pointing out Center County as an example there. And I think a future challenge will be keeping our older residents in their homes for a longer period of time, especially with the graying of rural Pennsylvania, folks living in their houses for 20 or more years, folks who have disabilities. These are all considerations that those who are involved in the housing industry are going to have to consider now and for the next few years to come. So those are some key takeaways from these data. And again, if there's anything that we could do to provide any data analyses, some snapshots, maps, anything of that sort that might be of interest, I would encourage you to go to our website, www.rural.palegislature.us. You can also Google us. We'll come up online. You can send me or any of my team members an email, and we would be happy to be of assistance in any way that we can. So I know I threw a lot at you, and hopefully we can have a good conversation here, and I can try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kopka. There are a couple questions that are coming through, so I'm going to share them as they come in, and we could hopefully answer them together over the next 30 minutes. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
All right, first question. Do you have any data to show the drivers behind the movement from more folks owning their home to more folks now renting? So that change of home ownership to renting. Any thoughts, comments? There is an additional remark about the diminishing of the middle class. Is that a factor that you recognize, or are there other factors?
I think there's some of that going on, certainly affordability. And I'm curious to see how the COVID pandemic affects this too. And I should note, just as an aside, much of the data presented here was cut off in 2019. We're normally running at least a year behind. And anecdotally, we're hearing from communities that COVID is going to have a negative impact on home ownership rates. And I expect that to be, something we observe in the data whenever it's released in another year or two. So I think certainly that is a factor. The other factor, I think, to getting back to demographic changes with regard to age in those 65 years of age or older, it might simply be cheaper and easier for a lot of seniors to live in a rented facility, housing unit of some sort, if they're not able to maintain their properties any longer. So I think it's a question that involves multiple answers, and those two are they help to explain some of the variance. It's not everything, and plus we do have more people coming into different parts of rural Pennsylvania who might be immigrants from outside the area, outside the country too. And at least in the short term, they would be looking for rental opportunities. That's not a huge swath of the population, but it is a consideration. So there are multiple reasons why this is happening.
Yeah, and I think it's also both sides of that age spectrum, right? We also have millennials, that population that's 25 to 40, that are just less inclined to purchase homes. So that's another unique
Exactly.
factor that we're seeing within our communities.
Absolutely. And that's something that we've seen even at the national level too. Folks are delaying home ownership for a wide variety of reasons. I'm sure many of our viewers know that many young people are also living at home more than what they had, 20 years ago. So I think an open question is to what extent this is a permanent or lasting change. And we just don't know. And obviously the pandemic situation, it changes a lot of these trends, and we just don't know to what extent um, these we just don't know yet how this is going to affect a lot of the housing markets or even economic indicators in the short term. There's a lot we simply don't know.
Mm-hmm. Sure. All right, another question that came in, and I would encourage the audience to continue to send them. Of the single person households that you referenced, do you have any age data? And what I'm guessing that is getting to is a greater breakdown other than just senior or not.
Sure. Let me see if I have something here. We do have this on file within our office. I don't have it handy right now as part of this presentation. But again, feel free to reach out to me. And I would be more than happy to compile some additional data, send it to you as part of a PowerPoint deck or a Word file, so that way you can have more detailed analyses available.
Yeah, and again, I'll cite that millennial population again, being much more likely to not only delay homeownership, but also marriage. That is another statistic that we've looked at from a handful of different perspectives, that individuals between 25 and 40 are also less likely to get married. So that's going to contribute to that single person household as well. And again, there's another question about the data source behind those statistics. So if we can relay that to our audience, that'd be great. Kyle, another question that came up was, have you looked at data specific to lot rental costs in mobile home parks? Are you seeing any trends in that space?
In terms of trends, we have about, I didn't present it in this slide deck here, but about 8% of the housing units or so in rural Pennsylvania involve mobile units. I don't have the data handy with me here right now. We do have that within our office, though. We could map that out over a period of years, so that way you would have that accessible. But right now, the snapshot is about 8% of units.
Okay. All right, another one specific to Berks County. This individual said that there's less availability of rentals in their rural areas compared to the urban settings. this organization or this person represents an organization, and they say that they have many clients who are interested in renting in rural living, but they have difficulty finding space, especially for those with criminal backgrounds. Any tips or comments there?
It's a really tough question. It's a supply and demand problem, as the viewer notes, and there are, for example, the USDA Rural Development has had a number of grant programs and loan programs over time to help facilitate, say, rural downtown development, where apartments could be developed above like storefronts in small downtowns, things of that nature. Um, and I would also encourage folks to check out the Pennsylvania Downtown Center. They've had obviously a lot of resources regarding downtown development to help facilitate these types of opportunities. But it's, especially during the economic downturn right now, it's been exceptionally difficult for many of these communities to branch out and invest in these types of properties. I don't have a silver bullet answer, I'm afraid, for something of this nature.
All right. When a county gets labeled as urban or rural, would that affect the funding equation for that county?
That's an excellent question. And it can, believe it or not, but not necessarily at the state level for our particular definition. We use that just for classification purposes for the most part. But at the federal level, it can matter. And it's, to make a very long story short, there are different definitions of rural from the Office of Management and Budget, the Census Bureau, the Social Security Administration. It's varied depending on the federal department. And there have been times where, say, a rural hospital has been considered part of a rural community as a matter of the state's definition, but maybe for Health and Human Services at the federal level, it may not have been considered rural. And our office has actually had to work with the federal agencies if there's a grant program to say that, as a matter of state classification, we do treat them as rural and ask them to reconsider that classification if there is a particular funding stream for rural organizations and rural communities. So that is something, and I'm glad the viewer brought this up. So it is something that we have done for organizations and municipalities before in the past. So if there are any concerns that maybe you're working with a federal office and you believe that you do meet, the definition of rural, at least as far as the state's concerned, but maybe not as far as the federal government's concerned, we would be happy to help provide additional information for any of those advocacy efforts to the federal government and be of assistance any way that we can.
All right, great. And this is circling back to the question that was raised prior about not having affordable or available rental space. Can you talk to us a little bit about the utilization of land trust as a potential solution for addressing some of that affordability and access?
It's a great question, and I honestly don't think that we've had any data on that as of late. I'm going to make a note of that right now. We are, and I want to use this also quickly as an opportunity for the viewers who are listening right now. As part of our grant program, we're also in the process of soliciting ideas for applied policy research topics, both things that we could ask faculty members at state universities to do, or that we could address in-house. And to my knowledge, I don't believe that we've addressed land trusts and how that might influence affordability of housing and availability of housing too. So I'm going to make a note of that right now, but if the viewer also wanted to be in touch via email, if they have very specific ideas on what that could look like, I think that could be a fantastic project for us to look into.
All right, great. And maybe just for those that are not as familiar, Can you just provide a brief description of a land trust?
So a land trust would be a kind of a cooperative venture, which a number of different parties or nonprofit groups could come together and provide any number of opportunities. In this context, we'll say for housing, and that could be used for a larger development project or something for a period of time for individuals who would want to obviously live there, but also in a lower cost rate, almost like a cooperative venture. So that's my quick shorthand definition.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. Another question about just PA residents graduating from college and either coming back to Pennsylvania or choosing not to return. Any demographic research on that, rural versus urban?
And we've published a few reports about this within the center. And it's particularly within rural areas. I'm sure many of the viewers are, accustomed to hearing about the brain drain issue within rural Pennsylvania. And we do see this shift happening over time. And one of the things that we're trying to look into now is what would it take exactly for individuals to come back to rural Pennsylvania? What we find in some of our survey analyses is that among younger individuals, they want to leave and find a job elsewhere, go to school somewhere else. But then there's also a lot of survey data that suggests that later in life, after they establish a family or they're in their 40s or 50s and they're career professionals, they very much like the idea of returning to rural Pennsylvania. And this is actually a common theme among a lot of rural residents. It's not just unique to Pennsylvania. We find this in other parts of the country too. The big challenge, though, is job opportunities and also access to, other types of amenities that they're used to having in other parts of the state or other parts of the country. And that's probably one of the biggest barriers too. Related to this, we've done a number of studies now on even say broadband availability and access. I think we've heard, at least anecdotally, through our contacts and community partners, that there are a number of individuals who are interested in telecommuting and working in a rural area. But still, there are wide swaths of the Commonwealth that simply do not have, adequate broadband access. We've pointed this out in some of our reports too, that as a matter of state law and definition, we define broadband as just about 1.5 megabits per second download speed and 0.2 megabyte upload speed. Now there's a broadband bill of rights. It was last updated in 2004, and anyone can request that broadband access and they'll get it, but it's very slow speeds. It's not the FCC definition of 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload, like the so-called Netflix speed. And I don't mean to spend a lot of time discussing this, but I think that this is a key problem for much of rural Pennsylvania, but it's also related to why folks may or may not want to come back at a later time if those types of amenities or infrastructure are not available. It significantly limits opportunities, not only for business and education, but just for one's lifestyle too. So I think that's something we're making progress on. The FCC provided a little over $300 million for broadband build out in rural Pennsylvania over the next 10 years. So it's something that's ongoing, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think we'll see a correlation between that number and people's desire to live in rural versus urban areas. We see that appeal if you're able to work out of a rural setting where you have an acre of land to play in, or 800 square foot apartment, especially as COVID has challenged and has opened up the eyes that telework is more possible, or more likely, to occur within organizations. It'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out.
And I can actually share very quickly, since we have some time, if you don't mind, I'll share one other um, bit of information here.
Please.
Here, this is the wrong screen. Sorry, here, let me go back here. There we go. So speaking of internet access, here's some additional data on those with internet access and those without internet access. So this is specifically to rural Pennsylvania households with and without. So not necessarily looking at urban, at least in this table here on the right. So just focusing on rural Pennsylvania for right now, these individuals without internet access, and this isn't even broadband, this is just no internet access at all. They tend to be a little older, 68 years of age is the average age, less household income, about $26,000 household income, 22% are at the poverty rate, 10% have children in the household, and this is obviously something we've been pretty concerned about, particularly during the pandemic and school children being able to have access to online learning. About 49% are women. Sorry, we duplicated the poverty rate here again. 4% are minority population, 23% have no high school diploma, 40% have some sort of disability. Only 27% are employed. And just think about that for a minute, and how much of job search opportunities now are online. It makes it very difficult. And 24% do not have a vehicle. The map here provides a snapshot in 2019 of the entire Commonwealth, both urban and rural counties. The average statewide percentage of households with internet access. Now, again, that's not necessarily broadband or high-speed internet. This is any internet access. So about 84%, 85% of households have some sort of internet access, and that could even be on your cell phone. The blue counties are those that are above the average, and the white counties are at or below the average. And it tends to be those counties that are in rural Pennsylvania that are below the average. And at first glance, you might think, okay, this isn't so bad. Places like Lycoming County, 83%, Potter County, 80%, McKean County, 80%. Well, still, that's 1 out of 5 right, that don't have any internet access.
Can you zoom in on that map for us, Kyle?
Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger here for us.
If you click on view, I think you would get the option to zoom in at least. Or if you click on, that should be good. So for those that are joining us today, look at your county, look at the surrounding counties. And if you wanted to scroll down a little bit more just to show the key for that map, there you go. That's some very interesting data. And I think I'm glad that we were able to get to this slide, because from an advocacy standpoint, there's a lot of work to be done. Internet is often that lifeline for folks, and as you pointed out, 40% of individuals with no internet access also have a disability. And as you said, the poverty rate and employment rates, those are very concerning to see.
Yeah, and this is something that's worried the center for some time. Obviously, it has tremendous implications for all kinds of economic development, purchasing of a home, wanting to rent in a particular community. It's a far-reaching effect across so many different sectors. And again, for anyone who's interested in learning more about this too, we have some extensive maps on our website as well. We just published a new report, in late November with a team from Penn State, including Professor Sasha Meinrath, looking at connectivity types within rural and urban areas. And it's what you might expect. Rural residents have greater access to dial-up, DSL, things like that relative to their counterparts in urban areas. And even whenever there is, say, high-speed internet availability through cable or fiber or something like that, on average, it costs more in rural areas. So even though, getting back to the housing data, yeah, the average house price might be less in rural Pennsylvania. The average rent might be less in rural Pennsylvania. But I think that that's a key, amenity or utility, or however you might want to classify it. It might cost you a bit more depending on where you live, just because, it takes more for build out efforts, and there's fewer consumers and whatnot. So it does make for another additional economic barrier for a lot of folks.
Very interesting. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in through the chat at this moment, or the Q&A function. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, Dr. Kopka?
Let's see here. Let me zoom out. Since I have another minute or two, I can show some of our supplemental slides here. Just a very quick comparison between homeowners and renters within each category, urban and rural. The number of bedrooms tends to be more, for example, in apartment units in rural areas. How many people have been living in the same unit for 10 or more years as a matter of renting? 19% of rural renters, 17% of urban renters. Percent living in apartment buildings with more than 10 units. That's more common in an urban area as opposed to a rural area, as you might imagine. Similar rates of apartments that were built before 1950. Still really interesting to think about this. About a third of the units in both rural and urban were built before 1950. So older units there. Percent of renters with no vehicle available to them at all, as opposed to owning a vehicle. They just don't have access to one. 20% in rural areas don't have access, which is it's very difficult, obviously, for so many things in life. Whereas even in urban areas, there might be greater access to public transportation. That's not the case for many of our rural communities. You can see the differences between, say, the monthly mortgage rates between rural and urban. Tends to be a little more expensive in urban areas, obviously, and even differences in property taxes. And finally, we did put together just some brief data here on COVID within rural communities. So not exactly related to housing, but obviously it relates to employment and economic conditions, which is going to affect one's ability to have adequate housing. So the map here, though, pertains to rental relief program through the CARES Act. And the statewide average, only 4.3% of renters applied for this. So very, very small percentage, very, very small percentage. But if you break this out a little bit more, it seems like the lowest percentage of participations, tends to be predominantly in some of our rural communities in places like Jefferson, Elk, Warren, McKean, Potter, Tioga, Center County, so on and so forth. So there does appear to be this gap even in terms of federal government resources, particularly due to economic stimulus that are reaching rural individuals.
Yeah, and that certainly begs that question of, is it a matter of access, communication style? What barriers were in place that kept that program from being truly successful in almost every part of our state here? To see that what's the highest, Allegheny at 6.8% utilization.
And Philadelphia too at 14%. So our urban areas, our urban areas tend to have done a bit better, as you might imagine, but there's also more community and civic groups to help get the word out about these types of things. And also, in more sparsely populated areas, there just might not be as great communication efforts due to online availability and access. Um, fewer government offices to get the word out, things of that nature. So it's not any one single problem, but it's this multifaceted issue.
Right. Yeah, only 3 counties, it looks like, had over 3% utilization rate. So as the next rental assistance program rolls out from the most recent package, I think that's something that we should keep our eye on how is the program delivered to those in need.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, we will be tracking this within our office. We also provide a weekly datagram, I should note, on our website, and we also post this on our social media channels. So if anyone has suggestions for those types of datagram requests where we can do a quick analysis, one of these types of maps, if that's of interest to you, please contact our office. We'd be happy to put that together if that's useful to your organization or your community.
Man, you have all the data. It's good stuff, Dr. Kopko. All right, it looks like we have 4 minutes left. Are there any other questions that people want to have us interact with at this point? All right, not seeing any. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you had some good takeaways. And if you are interested in receiving any of this information, I believe it was already shared by Stacy from the Housing Alliance, that this information, you can watch the workshops through the platform for the next 90 days. And then we can certainly get the presentations out to those that are interested in receiving this information. Thank you so much. We're glad that you're here. We appreciate that you're into this work and that you continue to advocate for your own communities as well as all of Pennsylvania. So thank you, and continue to fight the good fight. Dr. Kopko, appreciate you, sir.
Thank you very much, everyone.